It's hard to understate how much of a success the original Blair Witch Project was. It was a phenomenon as well as a hit, but if you're watching this video, you already know that. What you might also know is that if something is a hit in Hollywood, especially a big hit, there's bound to be a sequel coming down the pipeline. Artisan wanted to strike while the iron was hot. They knew the hype wasn't gonna last forever. Unfortunately for them, Haxan Films, the creators of Blair Witch, disagreed. Sure, they were interested in making a sequel eventually, but they wanted to wait for the buzz to die down. Give the sequel some room to breathe. Artisan respectfully disagreed by completely cutting them out of the sequel and hiring a new director. Did I say respectfully? I misspoke. I meant to say they were actively spitting on them. You actually want to make a product that stands on its own? Chumps. All we want is cartoon bags of money. Scrooge McDuck bags of money. So I can only assume their goal was to essentially just copy the original movie, with a new group of characters going into the woods with a bunch of cameras and meeting a similar fate. To accomplish this, they hired Joe Berlinger, who had up to this point only done documentaries. Sounds like the perfect guy for the job. Joe threw them a curveball, however, as he didn't want to make a found footage movie. He wanted to make a traditional movie that essentially served as a meta-commentary on the Blair Witch Project. His impetus for the decision was essentially that making a derivative copy of the original movie would be soulless, bad, and ultimately unfulfilling. Wait, how'd this footage of Blair Witch 2016 get here? So you think that Artisan would obviously shoot this down, but they just let Joe go ahead with his vision. They completely cut out Haxan, but they're just gonna let Berlinger do whatever he wants? That seemingly makes no sense. However, I suspect they let him do this because the movie needed to get underway immediately. The Blair Witch Project got its major theatrical release in July of 1999. Book of Shadows premiered October 27th, 2000. That's nuts. I can only assume they didn't have time to argue the details and just went forward with whatever Joe brought them. Well, almost. They demanded a few changes, but we can get into that later. So they got the movie filmed, got it into theaters, and waited for the money to roll in, baby.
Money, money, this money, money, that profit will make me wallet fat. What?
That's a bit of a discrepancy. People absolutely hated this movie, and this is basically where the franchise lost all steam and petered out. This fate is not really that surprising when you think about it. The Blair Witch Project is such a unique work that making a sequel to it that would please everyone was all but an impossibility. If you do the same thing again, people say it's derivative, be too original, and people say it's too different. Not to mention that the marketing was really what pulled people into the theater. Moviegoers went in thinking what they were seeing was actually real. Blair Witch 2 did not have that luxury. The cat was out of the bag, and it was basically marketed like any other horror movie, aside from a few attempts to copy the original's homework. So clearly this was a recipe for disaster from the start, and they probably should have just let Haxan take another crack at it when they were good and ready. That being said, we're 23 years removed from when this movie came out. The hype is completely gone for this franchise, and I was only 5 months old when this sequel was released, so I missed all of it anyway. So what do I think? I honestly think it's pretty good, and in my opinion it offers quite a lot in terms of being a Blair Witch sequel, and it definitely does far more work than people give it credit for. I'm pretty much going to spoil this entire movie, so if you never watched it because you heard other people say it sucked, I think you should give it a shot at the very least. But you better make damn sure you come back so I can get that sweet, sweet ad revenue. The movie follows a ragtag group of young people as they make their way to the Burkittsville woods, following the release of the Blair Witch Project and its subsequent phenomenal grip on the entire country. Pause there a second. Yes, you heard me correctly. The Blair Witch Project was released to theaters and is a fictional product. This is where the movie deviates in a big way from where most sequels would step. No one went missing, no real footage was shot. Like real life, it was just a movie. Unlike real life though, the legend of the Blair Witch does exist, and that includes everything surrounding it. So like the Eileen Treacle and Coffin Rock incidents still exist as legends at the very least, And the Parr murders definitely happened. I really think this is the biggest curveball the movie throws the audience. And depending on who you are, you either think this is incredibly stupid, or you love it. I'm completely for the latter. It automatically sets this movie apart from its predecessor, and in an extremely clever way. Who's more equipped to commentate on the frenzy of the Blair Witch Project than its own sequel? And unlike something like Gremlins 2 or Matrix Resurrections, which can only really comment on their effect on pulp culture, the Blair Witch Project broached reality. So, Book of Shadows is in the unique position to question just that, reality. In fact, the movie starts with real residents of Burkittsville and their thoughts on the whole phenomena. Beyond this, though, it uses this concept extremely well throughout the movie. The nature of obsessed fans.
I'm back and I say, I know it's real too, man, and we have a bond, we have a connection,
The filmmakers potentially offending and affecting the lives of other people.
This is what the Wiccan religion really needs, Jeff. More capitalism based on fear and lies.
And if art can be held to blame for tragedy.
Sadly, as has happened so many times before in this country, violent art has inspired real-life violence. In this case, it's the Blair Witch Project.
We're introduced to our main characters who all want to go to the Burkittsville woods for various reasons. Tristan and Steven, who are writing a book on the subject of the Blair Witch with a greater theme of mass hysteria. Erica, a Wiccan who hopes to get in touch with Ellie Kedward herself, and Kim, who just liked the movie.
You don't believe in the Blair Witch, then why the hell did you bother to come?
I thought the movie was cool.
This whole trip was organized by Jeff, who's kinda complicated. See, at face value, Jeff appears to be a fanatic of the Blair Witch Project, to the point that he has swallowed the legend wholeheartedly. However, in the movie itself, he's rather shady, and comes across as more of a grifter than someone who actually believes in the Blair Witch.
To the official Blair store. Come on in, everybody. This is where it all begins. This is the epicenter of the Blair Witch Hunt website.
It's rather strange, and as much credit as I give this movie, I don't think it was trying to portray him like this. Especially because in the mockumentary companion piece, Shadow of the Blair Witch, Jeff's portrayed as being an earnest fan. Oh, he's also a former mental patient, a fact that the movie really wants you to know. That being said, the intro to all our characters, it's handled pretty well. You get a good idea of everyone pretty quickly. While they're not all exactly on the same page, there is a sense of camaraderie, and it feels like a fun road trip. Very similar to how the first movie started. Unlike the first movie though, this is where you begin to notice Blair Witch 2's slant on how it portrays its characters. Heather, Mike, and Josh all felt like real people. Obviously, as that was the whole point of the movie. This is not the case here. While I like the characters in this movie, they are just that, characters. There really isn't an attempt to make these people feel like they're real. The paranoid stoner, the Wiccan, the goth, the straight man, and the plot device. To be fair, as the movie goes along, they start to shed more of their generic attributes, but on the whole, they're rather stock. That goes for the inhabitants of the area as well. In the case of the first Blair Witch, most of those interviews were actual local townspeople. Here though, the few locals they run into feel like they're from Twin Peaks or something. That goes doubly for the sheriff. You can take that as a good or bad thing. If you want the movie to be more in line with Blair Witch Project, then yeah, you probably hate this. But you could also argue that there's a meta angle to this as well, as the dramatization of quote-unquote real events is far more cartoonish than what in universe is a fictional movie. Regardless, I enjoy this choice. It makes the whole thing just a bit more surreal. Whether you love it or hate it, it's what the movie's going for. Also, as insanely over the top as the sheriff's performance is, I can't help but be completely endeared by it.
Get out of these woods and go home! There is no goddamn Blair Witch!
Okay, I gotta be real here. Most of everything in the beginning of the movie is good stuff. Them driving to the woods, actually getting there, and setting up camp is all done well. However, I have to single out the section of them actually camping as being the worst part of the entire film. It's actually just a painful sequence to watch. The movie could use this opportunity to flesh out these characters further. Instead of that, we get all the actors sitting around being movie drunk and high. Oh my god, guys, I'm so fucked up right now. It's actually freaking crazy how messed up on drugs and alcohol I am. Oh my god. The only important part of this section is when they meet this other tour group. Then they just go right back to drunken partying. Thankfully, this doesn't last long, and shit hits the fan in a big way. The group wakes up only to find everything they had with them totally destroyed and no recollection of what transpired last night. On top of that, they find the camera's tapes where they supposedly found Heather's footage from the Blair Witch Project. Before they can start pointing fingers, their attention is turned to Tristan. I skipped over this before, but Tristan is pregnant. She didn't want the baby, Steve did, and she had a dream of murdering her unborn child. You know, normal stuff. After rushing to the hospital, the pregnancy is deemed a miscarriage. Jeff, knowing that these people don't really have anywhere to stay, is willing to house them at his place for the time being. This also gives them the opportunity to try and piece together what happened last night. This is where the movie's real strength lies, as more and more weird things start happening and all the characters begin to lose their grip on reality. You see, I need to dispel something here. People often cite that one of the Blair Witch Project's strengths is its ambiguity. And while it's certainly true that all the scary bits are left to the viewer's imagination, it is certainly untrue that the events that transpired were not supernatural. The most probable explanation that isn't a supernatural one is that a group of vindictive locals decided to murder these 3 college students. And even that is extremely improbable. First of all, this isn't the Bayou, it's a village in Maryland. And while it is true maybe a few people in a town could be twisted enough to do this, the methods that would have to be employed to fuck with these 3 random kids are so elaborate that they'd probably need at least a group of 10 people to pull this off. Even so, it still doesn't explain how these supposed murderers would be able to guide Heather, Mike, and Josh into certain key areas that they would need them to go to. Unless you want to make the case that Mike, Josh, or both of them were in on it, but that doesn't really make any sense either. I'm not saying this is completely impossible, but the movie itself doesn't point to this being the case at all. So it's already improbable that it was a group of miscreants with the info we can glean from just the Blair Witch Project itself. However, there being a rational explanation goes completely out the window when we factor in Curse of the Blair Witch. Heather's footage was found by an archaeological team underneath a patch of undisturbed ground at the ruins of Rustin Parr's house. Case closed. There is no logical explanation for that. Whether it's actually the Blair Witch or some other kind of force, it's clear that it's supernatural. So while people merely think that Blair Witch Project is ambiguous on this angle, Blair Witch 2 is actually ambiguous. You see, the movie goes to great strides in order to constantly question what is actually happening. Stephen and Tristan's book is all about the idea of mass hysteria, and there are little seeds of doubt planted even before shit hits the fan. I also quite enjoy how the characters change. At the start of the movie, they're all pretty standoffish and honestly quite irritating, especially Erica.
Great American pastime. Blame it on a witch.
However, as they get more and more freaked out, their gruff personas start to drop and they either devolve into fright or paranoia.
It's Erica. Or whoever the fuck she is.
Has got nothing to do with this.
She's a witch, man. She's one big pissed off witch.
While this is happening, Jeff is simultaneously scrubbing through all of the recorded footage in an attempt to figure out what happened, only catching glimpses of weird imagery with fucked up timestamps. It honestly feels a bit Lovecraftian in a way, trying to get to the bottom of something through genuine curiosity at the start, only to have it become darker and more twisted the more you dig, is pretty much a staple of a lot of those stories. Look, it isn't all handled the greatest. Some of the scares are pretty laughable. You're probably not going to get under most people's skin with a Spirit Halloween electric chair prop. However, I appreciate what they're going for. In fact, for most of the movie, we don't even know if there's a tangible threat. There are weird occurrences, but nothing that actually physically harms the characters. It's not until around an hour in that the stakes are raised with the disappearance of Erica and the discovery that the other tour group was murdered.
These are 5 hikers found dead atop the landmark known as Coffin Rock.
Disemboweled, Jeffrey.
This is where the group completely devolves. Accusations, paranoia, and Tristan acting her craziest, which has been building throughout the movie. They eventually find Erica dead in a closet, which obviously exacerbates the issue. Kim eventually deciphers Tristan's ramblings as the key to finding their missing footage, only to discover that they were the ones who destroyed their own camp. Tristan reveals herself as the witch, or at least under the influence of it.
You're all gonna fucking die.
She ties a rope around her neck and goads Steve into killing her, which he obliges. The cops then bust in to arrest a lot of them, not only for the murders of the tour group, but for the deaths of Erica and Tristan. Well, considering we've been watching these characters the whole time, we know they didn't kill Erica, and they have proof of that, as there's video cameras all over the place. As for Tristan, yeah, Steve might be partially responsible, but she was goading him, and there's video proof of that as well.
Fucking witch.
Uh-oh, well, that's not good. This is where the movie really sells the supernatural versus mass hysteria angle. We've been shown the events from the perspective of these characters for the whole movie, only to have the rug pulled out from underneath us. We now have to question, what really happened? Was this all done under the influence of the witch or some form of evil from the forest? Or were these people just crazy? There's enough evidence pointing in both directions that you can make a good enough case for either, and that juxtaposes with the Blair Witch Project so well. Whatever was hunting them, it's very clear that they are in fact being hunted. There's also no cause to think that Heather, Josh, or Mike are insane. Sure, nerves get to them, but it's understandable given the situation. Blair Witch 2 is a complete judgment call on the audience's end, and that judgment call decides whether or not our main characters are essentially the villains of the film. This is also where this clip shows up that I mentioned earlier.
Sadly, as has happened so many times before in this country, violent art has inspired real-life violence. In this case, it's the Blair Witch Project.
Which could be interpreted as a snide remark from the filmmaker, like in a, of course they would blame the movie type of way. However, you could also infer this as a way of questioning how much the news media has an effect on people's judgment. Despite not knowing the situation whatsoever, they're completely ready to blame these people for murder, and at the same time condemn a piece of art. Maybe it's not a totally insane thought though. I mean, at the time the real town of Burkittsville was inundated with Blair Witch fans, upsetting the flow of the local people's lives. The start of the movie makes that clear enough. While it's easy to dismiss something like the Columbine Massacre's connection with Doom as being out of touch and fear-mongering, the fact of the matter is that Blair Witch Project used a real place with real people. Well, ultimately nothing even close to the events of Blair Witch 2 transpired. What if they did? Should the filmmakers be held responsible? Or should it also be dismissed as crazy people doing crazy things? I still firmly believe the latter, but I suppose you couldn't necessarily blame people for coming to the conclusion that it was the natural escalation of things. The movie doesn't answer that question. It hardly brings it up at all, and I may just be digging too deep into a snide comment. However, given the nature of this entire movie and the not quite reality it represents, there's probably something there. At the very least, it presents that question to the audience, and that's ultimately all an artwork can really do. I would like to end it there. Leave it on a positive note. However, I need to address the elephant in the room, and that's studio interference. While Artisan did let Berlinger do his weird meta-sequel, they eventually demanded changes. These included adding quick cuts of ritualistic murder in order to make Blair Witch 2 fit in the mold of a more traditional horror movie. You know, like the Blair Witch Project, the most traditional horror movie ever. Other big changes included adding flashbacks to Jeff in the mental institution. Finally, they somewhat cut up the interrogation scene and sprinkled clips of it throughout the film. Oh, plus they changed the name from Blair Witch 2 into Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows, despite the fact that there is no Book of Shadows in the movie. Well, the mental institution scenes and the murder cuts are just kind of annoying and more or less redundant. It doesn't actually harm the movie that much. However, the interrogation scenes being sprinkled in at random does actually fuck with the flow a bit. It pretty much just spoils a lot of the plot beats for no reason. You know they end up in custody, it spoils the fact that the other tour group was murdered, and it ruins a neat little moment with these dossiers. You see, there's a scene where Kim finds these folders in Jeff's desk, leading her and Steven to the obvious conclusion that he was spying on them. However, in the police interrogation part, you'll notice that the dossiers are the same ones from Jeff's desk. In the final cut of the movie, though, the scene in the police station plays right after they introduce these files. So the film is essentially just hitting you over the head with that fact, and it loses its impact. That being said, though, and unless I'm missing something, I don't think the studio interference is the smoking gun people think it is. As far as I can tell, about 80 to 90% of this movie is exactly the same as the original director's cut. And all this really is a grass is greener scenario, and it wouldn't have mattered that much if we got the original cut. The people who didn't like this movie aren't really sweating the little details. They ultimately want this to be a fundamentally different movie. In fact, I watched a fan edit that aimed to recreate Berlinger's original vision, and I was correct in my assumption that it would be pretty much the exact same thing. Don't get me wrong, it was better, but if you don't like Blair Witch 2, this isn't going to change your mind. When I think about this movie, it squarely fits in with the other Blair Witch stuff I like. It's never going to top the original Blair Witch project, but for me, no spin-off or sequel ever could. What interested me in things like Volume 1, Rust and Parr, the mockumentaries, and yes, Blair Witch 2, is that they all make excellent companion pieces to the original movie. They never overstep their bounds and step on the toes of the Blair Witch project. They have enough room to breathe as their own things while still being intrinsically tied to the original movie. On top of that, if you don't like them, they are quite easy to ignore. As it stands, I think Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows is an excellent companion piece to the original film. And when viewed as such, I think it has a lot to offer. It's fine if you disagree, but if you haven't watched it in a long time or never watched it, I think now would be a good time to give it another chance. Thanks for watching.
Fucking witch.